Welcome to Compass, finding spirituality in the everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn, and we are sitting down with Andrew Lang for a deep and enlightening conversation about redefining spiritual practices to suit modern life. Andrew shares his insights from his transformative experience at the Strozzi Institute, exploring the importance of centering and finding length, width, and depth in our bodies to connect with the relational space around us. So let me assure you this, what we get into today is highly practical, with Andrew offering poignant real-life examples, including things like how centering helped him handle his youngest child's tantrums. This episode also explores a variety of adaptable spiritual practices for you and the challenges of balancing traditional monastic routines with contemporary lifestyles, as well as the significance of integrating a spirituality with our body and emotions. So we're going to get into Andrew's journey from a negative church experience to how he established a personalized spirituality. And he invites us to evaluate our lives intentionally and creatively, highlighting simple and impactful routines like gratitude journaling, morning pages, and something called box breathing. We're going to find out about that. So join us for a compelling discussion that challenges common spiritual narratives, encourages experimentation with personal practices, and offers a roadmap for integrating spirituality into everyday life. And don't miss Andrew's valuable tips and reflections, and you can learn more about an upcoming 30-day cohort, which is designed to foster individualized spiritual growth, which, by the way, Compass listener, you may be able to get into for free. So if you're running on autopilot and wondering how you can clear some space in life, then check the show notes for this episode on umc.org and enter for a free slot. Andrew Lang is a spiritual director and coach. Andrew walks alongside folks building capacity to be more present in our lives and to the wisdom and stories that we carry. His practice is grounded in the fields of internal family systems, somatic awareness, contemplative spirituality, Jungian psychology, asset-based community development, organizing and activist work, and his time working in the U.S. education system. So that's a lot. Let's just get to the conversation and navigate spirituality in daily life here on Compass. Andrew, greetings to you out in the West. How goes it with your soul today?
It's going well. The dog is running around and doing the chaotic things that it does in the morning, but he seems happy, so I am happy.
Yes. Well, so let me ask you this then. I'm going to do a deep read, and this is probably way off. Are you an Enneagram 9?
I am not. I am a 1. And like through and through, almost like to every single piece of like different component of it. Whenever I talk with my friends who are Enneagram coaches, they're always just like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh, all right. So I guess I'm so self-focused. Like I know what 9 is, but what is 1?
So there's different names for it: perfectionist and fixer and reformer, blah, blah, blah. What I really think of in the way that I have interpreted the Enneagram 1 in my life and how it shows up is a sense of like, I need some order, doing things in a logical, straightforward, kind of sequenced way. There's a lot of control elements to it. And that has showed up in really unhealthy ways in my life, as well as I think I've been really working with it the last 4 or 5 years and moving into I think a way to maybe say it is like a consent-filled, open-minded sense of control, that nothing is truly controllable, but what is the way that I can order my surroundings and order my life that feels sturdy enough and flexible enough for when the waves of chaos come through, which they are perpetually doing.
Okay. Well, all this sense of giving order to things really kind of makes sense in my mind with some of the work that you're engaged in now. Can you give us like the elevator speech of like what it is that you do?
Yeah, totally. So I was an educator for 7 years, and my day job is I still work in education. I work in a nonprofit and I train teachers. But the work that I do with folks on the side of that is largely around how do we build spiritual practices, if folks use the spirituality language, inner work practices, but how do we build rhythms of our life that feel good for our bodies, that feel good for who we are, our sense of purpose, our sense of identity? And I think that's a big mind shift for folks around how are we building these habits into our life that help us ground and stay rooted in the context of chaos, in the context of every day getting pulled in different directions. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't feel like an add-on? So that's a lot of what I do and we work in cohorts of folks building those practices.
And what drew you into this work?
A weird experience, as is always the best way.
I love those. Yeah.
So when I was 18, I grew up in the Methodist church. And when I was 18, we were leaving a church and moving across town. And during the final Sunday, we'd been there for 11, 12 years. So during the last Sunday, we had kind of a big community goodbye celebration. And I'm like bawling my eyes out. And, at this point, I basically chosen baseball over church. It's my operating, my operating focus. But it was still my people. This is my community. I knew everyone by name, and everyone knew me. They'd watched me grow up. I'd watched them. And so here I am bawling my eyes out. And from across the sanctuary at the very end, service ends, and this man, Dale, comes across the room. And Dale, for some context, he is fully institutionalized in the church. He had grown up in the church, in that exact church. He basically grown up in that church, been there for 60 years, married in that church. And, any committee meeting, leadership structure, volunteer event, church, food event, no matter what, he was there. Even if he wasn't supposed to be there, he was there.
Okay.
Because he was a pillar of the church. So here he comes walking across the room. And he's, 6'2", 6'3", so big kind of force. And he comes straight up to me with my tears coming down my face, and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he looks me just dead in the eye. And he goes, "Men don't cry." And I just
that is not where I was expecting that to go. Okay.
Nope. Yep. There was the weirdness right there. Because it was this moment of, wow. In my moment of despair and sadness, that is rooted in beautiful things, right? Like community. In this moment, though, I'm being told, don't trust your body. Don't let your body do what it do. Don't trust your experience and your emotions. And so I had this question that popped up in me a couple days later that, was, I think, percolating in my understanding of what happened in that moment. Because I knew it was wrong. But what was percolating up for me was this question of if this is what a lifetime of spirituality and spiritual development, spiritual practice, spiritual formation, church attendance, if this is the outcome, then why bother? Because this ain't it. And there's lots of nuance around that. And it wasn't necessarily a fair question. And I recognize that now. And it really led me in a journey of figuring out, what does practice look like that does ground me in a spirituality that is human affirming and body and emotion affirming? Yeah.
Okay. I'd love to just kind of cut to the chase and be like, okay, what does that look like? But I would feel like, yes, we'll get a sense for what that is. And it's probably not something that's answerable even within a 30 or 45 minute chat. But let's play around with a scenario to begin with then. So say that you're approached by somebody who says, I feel like I'm stuck in a rut. I feel like I'm on a hamster wheel where my life just kind of keeps spinning around and I'm going through motions, stuck in routine. What are some steps that you might recommend they respond with right off the bat?
Totally. The first question I often ask is, and there's an exercise I sometimes lead folks through, but it's essentially mapping out what is your life? What are you currently doing? What are the actions, behaviors? What are the conditioned tendencies you have? Basically, what are the relationships you care about that you're in? What are the relationships that are really difficult that you're in? Basically, let's get it all out in front of us. Because if we're able to name it first, that's a huge step. I think there's this beautiful quote that I think about a lot. And it's James Finley. He's a psychotherapist. He was a teacher of mine down at the Living School. He was under Thomas Merton for 6 years at Gethsemane. And he says, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves skimming over the surfaces of the depths of our own lives. And I think that gets to it is oftentimes because of the hamster wheel, because of our, everything we have to do to survive the day to day, we just keep swimming, like Dory says. We just kind of keep going. Or to change a little bit, we just keep skimming. We just keep surviving.
Okay.
And so the first step I always invite people to is, all right, first off, let's take a look around. Let's notice, what is the quality of your skimming? What is the quality of your life? What is the quality? Let's get it all out on paper. Let's map it out a little bit, because that opens up the doorway to, all right, now we can be more choiceful. Do we want to dip our toes into the water? What are the fears when we look down into the water? What are the fears that are coming up for it? Is it a fear that you've never really looked into your inner life? You've never gone back and processed some of those stories that make you who you are. So there's fear there. Or is it a fear of, when I look down into my depths, I'm scared there's nothing there. I'm scared that this is really all there is. And so we can work with those fears and figure out what's the next step that feels right.
So as you're talking about mapping things out on paper, is that listing out those fears, or is it just kind of going through, here are the routines of my life, or what does that look like?
Tangibly, it usually looks like writing stuff out. This comes from my training as a teacher, but and it's never the same way for everyone. I've had folks do that kind of practice, doodling it out, mind mapping, lots of circles, little squigglies. I had one person who was a cartoon artist, and they were doing it in cartoon like boxes, all these different moments of their lives and aspects and components of their life. And so it can look a lot of different ways. And realistically, like if we think about what happens in a therapy session or a therapist's office, oftentimes those kinds of questions and processes are the things being explored verbally. And so there's this gray area and crossover, I think. And ultimately, this is where I think spirituality and therapy really have just a genuine, beautiful connection, because both are asking, what is true, what is real? How do we see the world clearly? How do we see our lives clearly? And so tangibly, it looks like get a piece of paper and start just in the classroom, we used to call it brain dumping. Dump it all out on paper, and then you can organize it however you need to make sense of it. But from that point, we can be choiceful about, all right, what are the qualities in our life that are numbing? What are the qualities in our life that are exhilarating? What are the qualities in our life that are so troubling or so struggle filled that they keep us, if not skimming, actually sinking in a negative way? So we can kind of look at those different kind of boxes and figure out what to do.
Do you find that a lot of people tend to dwell on the areas of troubling? So, for example, maybe the elements of depth are there within their lives and even part of their daily lives, and yet they still kind of just dwell on the getting by features of life. I don't know if that's making sense, but they tend to get their minds stuck on just kind of the routine and the negative.
For sure. Yeah. And I think there's what we always have to remember, what I always have to remind myself, because it's daily for me, is that our bodies have attuned to getting us through the day-to-day in a way that is protective. Our body's job is to sustain itself, right? And so the status quo that we've all been indoctrinated into, and then, I like to think of it as a conveyor belt, and we might be comfortable on it. It might not be great for us, but it's comforting. And so our body wants to stay there in a lot of ways. And that's what I think one of the core barriers or frustrations that I experience with folks that I work with is that there is a level of comfort. The status quo works for me. And there is a deep longing from somewhere in them. I think of like The Sound of the Genuine from Howard Thurman. There is something strumming up from within them saying, yes, there's a level of comfort, a quality of okayness, but there's also this beautiful song that's trying to be sung through me, and I don't know what to do with those two both being true at the same time.
You've brought up the idea of living our mental state through our bodies a few times. And I'm wondering how the spiritual relates to that. Are there ways that that you're able to incorporate a spiritual practice that, in a sense, offers relief to our bodies, or at least a sense of connection or interplay with our bodies?
One of the most foundational pieces for me is recognizing that when I say I'm including my body. And I think that's a deeply spiritual statement. That like we, what I often see, and everyone can check this for themselves, but what I often feel certainly is that we default to thinking that I actually exist as my brain. And my body is the vehicle to get my brain, aka me, from place to place. And so I think one of the deeply spiritual shifts is that the entirety that is me, this living organism of me, is my full body. And in the Christian sense, I think a lot of, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness? And that's not just my brain. That's not just my cognitive self. That's my full being, my body too. And so where that starts in a lot of our work that I lead is, what are the narratives that keep my brain and my body separate and defaulted? So thinking about, I really don't like the way my thighs feel. I really don't like this part of me. Okay, let's spend time on that. And let's spend time, what would it look like instead of objectifying your thighs, which is by definition taking your essence of who you are and then making some part of you an object instead, that you can look at and judge. So part of it is just, how do we begin to wrap ourselves around those spaces of our bodies that we have so many, oftentimes shame and guilt filled messages around, so that we can begin to this is not a word, but like re-whole ourselves, and remind ourselves that this entirety of us is us. And that's where the spirituality, I think, is just so infused, which is that when we can exist as a fully formed living organism, there's an element of saying, and if we're made in the image and likeness of God, like, there's God here, right now, with my thighs that I don't love, which is a very true story for me that I constantly work with.
From your own personal. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for being that authentic self with us. So are there specific practices that you've seen help people really kind of, as you put it, I love the word, we're going to use it. It's part of the lexicon now, re-whole within their bodies?
Yeah, there's a couple that come to mind. So the one is what I've already said, and it's so simple, but I can't stress enough how valuable it is. And it's a core component of the cohort I lead, which is the noticing and naming. Just simply the practice of every day noticing the narratives you've got, or noticing even around you, noticing something beautiful and naming it, noticing a moment where you experience the divine and naming it. So the noticing and naming, I think, is a huge can be a life-defining practice in and of itself. Other ones that I think about, there's a practice called just centering. That's from the Strozzi Institute, which is a somatics-based institute out of, I want to say, California. And it's the first time I've ever heard centering defined in a way that landed with me. So, there's all these times in meetings where let's just take a few moments to center ourselves before we begin, because we know this meeting's got a lot of stuff. So we're going to center ourselves first. Or there's church services that I've been in where, we'll have 3 minutes of centering prayer at the beginning, and then we'll go. And what's hard about all of those is that oftentimes, one, it's the precursor. It's basically saying, hey, we're going to center, and then so that we can be more productive in the meeting. Or we're going to center at the beginning of church, often in my experience, so that we can say we did a practice and then do church as per the usual. And so the practice of centering, when I heard about it through the Strozzi Institute, shifted it for me. What the practice looks like is, the first step is to find your length in your body. And so whether you're sitting or you're standing, you're really getting your spine aligned. You're bringing the top of your head up. You're feeling your body's length, and you're standing in whatever way you want to call it, but standing in a way that, or sitting in a way that feels dignified based on your definition of that word. And then you find your width and you actually sense, what is my left hip feeling? And this was a big moment for me because I realized I don't have any idea of what my skin feels during the day unless there's a breeze. Because my clothes have become such a part of me that I don't know. So you find your width, you find what are your senses on your sides, and then you connect with the relational space around you, who's around you, and you try to sense connection. And then you center with your depth. And so you try to feel, what's touching your back. Can you feel your clothes on your back? Can you feel your clothes on your front? And then you try to sense connection to everything that has come behind you, or everything that has come in your past, everything that supports you, your ancestors. And then you fill out your depth in the front. What is your purpose? And you center with your purpose going forward. That sounds like a lot.
That does. Yeah, we've gone from just like doing a posture check to, wow, yes, I'm considering my ancestors now. Okay.
Yeah. It can, and there's different levels. So I'll share a really quick example. I use that practice often, and I was just writing about this a couple of days ago. I use that practice often when my youngest kid throws a fit. He's 4 years old and he's got some big feelings right now. And when he throws a fit, I can feel my conditioned tendency, especially we started talking about control. A lot of my conditioned tendencies around control and order kick in as my default. And so my practice, my work there is I try the best I can to do that centering practice. It takes about 5 seconds. And at minimum, it's a posture check, right? At minimum, it's a, get myself feeling dignified again, feel my width, feel my depth, remember my purpose, be more skillful in my next move, be more choiceful. And then it can also be a much bigger practice. So one of the things we talk about in the cohort is a lot of times people stop or don't start doing intentional practices because they can seem so huge. Who's got time to sit for 20 minutes a day in silence if you've never done it before? Dear God. Yeah. And so one of the things we talk about is play with the size and the shape and the complexity of a practice. Because the point is not, this is something else James Finley said, but he talks about the fidelity of practice. How can we have a fidelity to practice, not necessarily a specific practice, if that specific form isn't filling us or isn't fitting us in the way we need it to? So permission, I always love this, reminding ourselves of we already have permission by way of being humans to experiment with finding a practice that feels good for us.
I want to dwell on that commitment to practice for a minute, because with a lot of these, you brought up a sense of centering. And if you're to Google centering prayer, like it's going to tell you, well, you're going to focus, you're going to choose your sacred word, you're going to focus on it for 20 to 30 minutes. And that is a non-starter for a lot of people, right? I love the way that you're able to speak to some of the ways of building these practices in a meaningful way without this fear of adding on, like another time block to the day. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Totally. So full disclosure, my first spiritual practice that I chose into when I really kind of started leaving the church after my experience with Dale that I mentioned was centering prayer. That was it felt right to me for a season. And I never did. I think the official guidelines for is, 20 minutes in one sit and then 20 minutes in a second sit, 2 sits a day. College students, me, was not going to be doing that. It just never.
That's valuable nap time. Like,
that's what
you got 20 to 30 minutes. Like those eyes are shut. Yeah.
I got things to not do. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is, yes, it's daunting. Those big chunks of time are daunting, or other practices. I think about, there's things like the welcoming prayer, which is very similar to centering prayer, but also practices like chanting are beautiful for some people and simply are a non-starter for others. And so the first piece that I think is a big mindset shift for us in the cohort when we do it is the practice that works for one person isn't going to be the practice for another person. And not only that, but the practice that works for one person during one season of their life isn't going to be the practice that fits that same person in another season. And that's okay. I think about there's this glorification of the dark night of the soul I think, especially in spiritual practice, where you're going to go through a time when it's a flourishing practice, then you're going to go through the time that feels dull and there's just nothing there, and just keep going, fidelity to the practice. And I just don't get down with that. I think that that glorification or romantic, like all of that was based in a context that is not our own. And this is a context piece to our practices, but when we talk about spiritual practice, many of them, if not most of them, were born out of monastic context, right? We're talking about monks in a sometimes cloistered, in a very set apart environment where their main job, aside from doing work to maintain the abbey or the monastery, their main job was spiritual practice. That is not our context. And so it feels weird to try to take spiritual practices that were born in that space and directly mirror them into our life. And I think what happens is the natural guilt and shame of, I tried this thing. I tried 20 minutes a day and it fell apart 3 days later. I need to try better. I need to do more. And I think that gets us into a cycle where we do a spiritual practice for 1 week and then it falls apart and then we leave it for the next 3 years and we keep skimming on the surfaces.
Well, that brings up the question then of effectiveness. Like, how do you know it is actually being effective? Somebody might try, again, I'll go back to centering prayer for a few days, and they're like, I can't stay concentrated and nothing happens. So what's the deal? Like, how do you know, or how do you measure or get a sense of effectiveness or purpose behind your spiritual routine?
Yeah, totally. One part of it is small and micro, and I think this is true for me, which is if you try centering prayer and you're sitting for 20 minutes and you have an amazing moment that is life-changing, great. Then that has been an extremely effective practice. And it might be trash for the next 7 years of trying to do it, right? So there's a level of effectiveness of sometimes there's so much going on in the world that just sitting for 20 minutes in a somewhat of a formulated way can be exceptionally effective. Now, there's the other part of it, which is how do we make it effective over time? Part of that, I think, is the question of how do we make sure we are identifying practices that are a fit for us? And so when I think of effectiveness, I think of what is helping you feel more alive, what is helping you connect with others, and then what is helping you feel more grounded or connected internally with your story, with the essence of you, with what Thomas Merton would refer to as the true self, with God in you, with the divine, whatever language that fits for you and that makes sense for you. But I think those three components are really big for me around how do we measure effectiveness? What is the quality of our connectiveness or our connectivity and our aliveness? And is that quality deepening in a way that feels right or feels good or feels life-giving for us? Because if we go back to the skimming over the surfaces, the effectiveness is, do you feel like you are skimming a little bit less? Do you feel like your toes are now in the water? Do you feel like you've sped the opposite direction and are now running full speed away from, because that's maybe less effective. But I think I think so much of the effectiveness question can often be, how do we measure this? And the best thing I can think of is, what is the quality or the depth of connection that you're feeling?
We've talked about centering prayer a bit, and that's different than the centering that you brought up initially. To maybe broaden our scope of what people might enter into as they're trying to implement or draw in a practice within their day. I'm guessing that you probably have, in a sense, a library of practices that you're able to pull from. Are there any that you see are really helpful to people, especially those who are kind of stuck in that sense of, well, I don't know if I have the time, like my day just doesn't permit me to really carve something out? Do you have some recommendations for that kind of situation?
Totally. I'll frame this with a framework first, and then I'll share some just practical practices. The framework we use in the cohort, one of them, I have this like funny little list of like 8, I think I call them tinker tools. And they're basically, when you find a practice that doesn't feel quite right, here are 8 ways to play with them. And so one of them is what we call core and secondary. And it's the framework of find a practice that feels right, feels like a fit for you. That's your core practice. You're going to do that sometime in the early part of your day, first half of the day, or first half of whatever your time frame is. If you're doing a practice once a week, whatever. But find your core practice, and then just like the moon is moving around, then find a small secondary practice that kind of exists out there. That if life happens as it do, and you don't get to your core practice, what is your secondary practice that you can make sure you do? It's usually much smaller, much simpler, requires way less anything, and still is building a capacity. And that's where we go back to the fidelity to practice, not a fidelity to a specific practice. So that's kind of the framing. Here are some practices that we had in the last cohort that I just thought was, they're just beautiful. Some of them are meditation, centering prayer. We had a couple people doing centering prayer and different forms of meditation from different traditions. We had people doing morning pages, which is just a beautiful morning kind of journaling session. And there's a little bit of a structure to it, but not much. We had people doing gratitude journaling, that was their kind of core practice. One of the big hits, and I was really surprised by this, one of the big hits was the practice of box breathing. And for those who aren't familiar with box breathing, or maybe haven't started meditation or ever tried it, box breathing, it's really become popular in meditation circles as an easy way in. And it's actually used by several people in our different military fields in the United States. And it is a practice of basically you count your breaths, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. So inhale for 4, hold it, exhale for 4, hold it, and just picture a box going round and round just like that. And it's a great starter meditation because it focuses your attention. It's considered a single point meditation method. You're focusing your attention on your breath. You're focusing your attention on the counting until it becomes habitualized, that your body knows what 1, 2, 3, 4 feels like. And then you're just breathing. So that was a big hit, specifically for folks who don't have a lot of time. Because this is certainly me. We talk about set aside practices versus integrated practices. Meditation is almost always a set aside practice. And those are the practices a lot of us, usually me certainly, kind of buck against. I don't have time. I just can't do that. So I go for
there's a quiet space. Yep.
Exactly. The context, either the practice doesn't fit me or the context doesn't fit the practice. And so what I really love for people who don't have a lot of time is find an integrated practice. Find a short box breathing could be one of them that you can do during a meeting. Find the centering practice is an integrated practice. You're supposed to do it with your eyes open. I didn't mention that earlier, but it's an eyes open practice so that you can do it in times of high stress, or you can do it when you're in the midst of everything. There's also just walking practices, an integrated practice for me that I do often. And it's a little set aside, so it blurs the line a little bit. But when I go to work, I walk more than anyone else in my office by far. And it's because that's my connection point. And so if I'm able to take a 15-minute break, I walk the park that's next to our building. If I can't take a break and I'm like on a call, I find a way that I can be on the call and walking at the same time so that I can look and feel connected to my context. There's lots of different ways of playing with a practice in order for it to fit you. And I think the big weight off my shoulders was realizing, hey, we can experiment. We're humans. We can experiment and find what fits. And if one thing doesn't fit, it doesn't mean we stop. It doesn't mean that everything ends. It just means that this wasn't a fit right now in this season. That's okay.
Yeah. I love that invitation, not just for specifically what we're talking about with practice, but broadly in our spirituality as well, is the idea that, not everything is 100% prescriptive.
Yeah.
With the, basic instructions laid out in step-by-step process, that there is a sense of interplay there. Mm-hmm.
Totally. I'll share a quick story because this was a mind a shift moment for me. Is I remember I used to go to Compline in Seattle at St. Mark's Episcopal. They have this beautiful Sunday night 9:30 to 10 Compline service, and I used to go. And the cool thing about it,
can you describe what Compline is for those who aren't familiar with the term?
For sure. So it's a beautiful space. You walk into this big cathedral. Compline is one of the stations that is often practiced in monastic spaces. And so in the context of St. Mark's, it's an all men's choir that stands in the back. They walk in total silence, walk to the back, and then they sing the office. And they sing, probably for 30 minutes, a couple psalms, a couple hymns, a couple prayers. And it's just and here's the cool thing, is that you have a cathedral that is filled with people who are religious and not religious. It brings out everybody because it's so different from what the rest of our culture and society has. And one of the big moments for me was, here I am doing centering prayer in this context, this beautiful singing going on that half of it feels like Latin. I don't understand any of it. I don't think it ever was Latin, but it certainly sounded like it.
And a little bit of a confirmation bias there, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I think it's Latin, sure. Therefore it must be that. Yeah.
But so here I am doing centering prayer, and there's another person there that I'm with who's also doing centering prayer. And I know that that's her practice. And the next thing I know, my eyes are closed. And of course, I get distracted at some point, and my eyes pop open, and I take a look around, and there she is doing yoga. And I talked to her after. I was like, were you doing centering prayer? What was your practice tonight? And she was like, and she made this comment that shifted everything for me. And she said, I was doing both, because a practice can be moldable to what your body feels like it needs in that moment to feel connected. I mean, she didn't use the connected word, but to feel here, to feel present. And that was a moment for me of like, yeah, my centering and prayer practice doesn't need to be a specific position. It can involve other things. And I am sure that if I talk to someone in the centering prayer world, they would have, that's not quite the right formula. And as humans, nothing is perfect. As humans, we get to experiment. I think that is the part of me that is still so in love with bits and pieces of the Christian story, is that the God and the divine movement through our history has always been so unabashedly creative. Parts of me in my history would have seen that as unbelievably chaotic. And I think the growing edge for me now is what looks like chaos might be chaos. And also there is creativity even in that. And so I think there's if we're made in the image of likeness in that way, then there's an invitation for us to see ourselves and our stories in a similar way, with creativity at the very core.
Andrew, it sounds like you've mentioned the cohorts that you work with. How often do you have cohorts forming?
We do 1 or 2 a year right now. I would love to get up to 3 or 4. That's kind of a rough vision someday, sometime, when it feels, as you've probably figured out, one of my favorite ways of saying anything is if it feels right. if it fits. If it fits. But right now, yeah, we had one in February. We'll have our next one in October 2024. And then we'll do another one probably in January the following year. And they're 30-day cohorts. And the entire vision and beauty of them is you find a practice. And if that practice is what you do the whole month, awesome. If it's not, we provide workshops to tinker and to kind of guide you through that space. But we have 9 different workshops over the course of the month, ranging from how to build a practice that feels good to what does, if you're familiar with the Enneagram, how you can use Enneagram in inner work. We have James Pearson is joining us in October for a workshop on internal family systems and how that can connect to practice. And then we've got another workshop on, what does activism look like from this space of deep inner work. So we kind of move through this, it's 30 days, so it's not a long time, but we move through these series of workshops that are really building complexity in our lives. How do we view ourselves and our connection with the world around us as fully connected, as fully integrated together? It's a beautiful experience. It's usually, maybe 10 to 20 folks. And it's really great. Everything's on Zoom. Yeah.
Cool. And you can learn about those as well as learn a little bit more about your story at andrewlang.com, right?
andrewglang.com. There's a random
G Lang, there
G.
it is. All right.
It was not my choice to add the G, but at some point it got added.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. I was thinking, boy, he must have got on it super early to get andrewlang.com. But
yeah. I did not.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing of yourself and your perspective with us on the Compass podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Dear listener, thank you for being a part of our Compass community. We look forward to continuing to explore spirituality in the everyday with you. You might want to listen to another episode of Compass. And if you like this episode, then I recommend episode 133. It's our episode with John Pavlovitz. It's called Cultivating Empathy in Polarized Times. Or an episode that would gel nicely with this one was episode 125 with Abigail Brauka. It's called Cultivating Everyday Spirituality. I'll bet you can guess what that is about. Hey, while you're listening, or even right now, leave a rating and or review. Those reviews help us connect with future guests. So it's an important part of us being able to deliver meaningful stories and content for you. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications. And that is all for this week. I'm having a hard time speaking, so let's just end it. We'll be back with a new episode in 2 weeks, so I'm going to chat at you then. Peace.